Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? As usual, I'm doing absolutely fabulous, and I hope you guys are keeping lovely and warm wherever you are, because it's getting a lot colder, and we all need those lovely cups of hot chocolate. But whatever you're drinking, let me know about it. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my heart was heavy, weighted down by the oppression of my regret, and of all the missed opportunities in my life that I'd thrown to the wayside and dismissed due to the bullheaded way I sometimes handled things. I sat by the crackling fire, watching the golden flames dance around the timber in the hearth as it spitted, popped, hissed and sizzled. There was something rather reassuring about a cosy warm fire on a cold winter's night, but even the fire didn't warm the coldness in my heart. I sat back on my leather recliner, lifting up the leg area, flickering the control on my television, but every station did not resonate with me. It was absolute drivel, from boring sports commentators to television presenters putting on those dreadful, cheerful laughs. When you're feeling as flat as a pancake and as grumpy as a belligerent badger, those fake laughs can be so nauseating. I sighed and poured myself a Manhattan, taking a huge swig of the pungent cocktail to console myself. As soon as the alcoholic beverage hit the back of my throat, burning it slightly, I felt relief, so I poured myself another. That was so much better. I glanced around my Seattle apartment with a cursory look. It really was a man cave that could certainly do with a feminine touch. It was begging for a touch of the savoir-faire to soften the rough edges of my apartment. A vase of flowers, some attractive curtains, some interesting artwork would not go amiss in this apartment of mine that was begging for a woman's finer touch. Indeed, many of my former female guests had remarked on how stark my home actually was. My living room boasted a large bookshelf that extended across the entire right-hand side of the wall, bursting to the seams with detective novels. There was a chunky brown leather settee with a furniture that was designed for comfort rather than elegance. A large ornate walnut coffee table. On its surface was a bowl of fresh green apples, along with the in-house telephone, a notepad and pencil. There was a large fluffy cream rug that graced the oak wooden floors, and of course central stage was the stunning fireplace with the oak mantel, balancing a few of my knickknacks. The walls of my home were undressed, apart from a picture I'd bought at the flea market of President Abraham Lincoln, who was positioned over the mantel in my living room. Sometimes I had drunk a little too much. It would seem that the eyes on the portrait would almost come alive. It was at times like these that I would toast Mr. Abraham Lincoln himself, as I was doing so now with my Manhattan. "Good evening to you, good sir," I said, swinging my glass towards the picture. "May God bless America." Interrupting the precious silence was the nagging sound of the telephone. I lifted the receiver. "Hello, darling," came my mother's voice. "Hi, Mum," I groaned. "Sweetheart, I'm worried sick about you. You haven't been yourself recently. Last time I saw you, I noticed your pants were getting rather loose. I'm worried you're losing weight and that you're not eating. It's because of Melanie, isn't it?" "Mum, please, let's not go there. My personal life really is not your business." "Oh, but it is my business. Everything that concerns you is my business. I'm your mother, after all. If my son is distressed about something, I'd very much like to help. What on earth happened? I thought you and Melanie were so perfect together. What went wrong between the two of you?" "I'd rather not go there, Mum, if you don't mind." "Sometimes, sweetheart, it helps to talk about these things. I can see this breakup has hit you very hard." "I don't want to talk about it, Mum. Please, will you go now?" "Look, I don't want to be a nag, but you're keeping yourself warm, aren't you? It's freezing out there. There's quite a wind tonight. I worry that you're not eating enough." "Mum, I'm very warm. I'm sitting by a crackling fire, and I've eaten enough." "Good, sweetheart. I do worry about you. I'm your mother. It's my privilege." "Bye, Mum. Nice talking to you." I sighed as I put the telephone down. Why did my mother have to bring up Melanie's name again? It had been 3 months since I'd broken up with her. I was cursing myself for such an impulsive, off-the-cuff decision. It made me physically sick to think about what had happened between the two of us. Reliving that night over again was not what I wanted to do. The moment I met Melanie, I realised that she was different to anybody else I'd ever known. I had blown it with her, like I did with every other relationship I ever had. Why was I such a disaster at dating women? Other men seemed to land with their bums in a field of clover, but not me. Over and over again I kept making the same mistakes with women. My problem was jealousy. I hated to admit it, but the green-eyed monster had reared its ugly head in many of my relationships. When I got jealous, I literally blew smoke out of my nostrils, acted irrationally, impulsively, until I not only rocked the boat, but I capsized the bloody thing in the process. What can I do? Like most men, I had to live with my mistakes, and that was not easy. I had met Melanie when I was flying back from Vegas to Washington. She had ended up sitting next to me on the plane. A fine dusting of serendipity touched my life that day, like the sprinkles of icing snow on a mince pie. I remember she was reading exactly the same Agatha Christie novel as I was. We were astounded that two people on exactly the same plane should be reading the same novel at exactly the same time, only pages apart. I was on page 102, she was on page 103. I mean, what were the chances of that? As you can imagine, that was really an icebreaker. We both talked the whole way back to Washington, about the books we appreciated reading, the wonderful countries we'd visited, the things that we enjoyed doing. I'd realised we had so much in common. I knew I wanted to see her again. She was easy on the eye, with long dark brown hair, highlighted with blonde streaks, sparkling hazel eyes, with 2 cheeky dimples on either side of her cheek that made her look younger than her years, as similarly we were both in our early 30s. "We must do this again," I said, taking down her number, tucking it in my wallet. But for some reason I lost it. I had stupidly written it on a $10 note with a red marker. I imagine I must have paid someone with that $10 note. It wasn't the cleverest or brightest idea of mine. I had no idea where she worked, what she did for a living, or even what her surname was. So I resigned myself to the fact that I had let a good thing slip through my fingers like butter. I was so disappointed with myself, as anyone I dated after meeting her was just so dull by comparison. Melanie had struck me as having such a great sense of humour, had been easy to talk to, so our conversation had flowed without any awkward silences. About 5 months later, when my nephew had to go into accident and emergency after making a petrol bomb, would you believe it, with his best friend Thomas in my backyard, it exploded, causing him to acquire some 3rd-degree burnings on his lower arm. My yard shed had completely been obliterated as shards of timber were scattered all over the lawn like pieces of shrapnel from a war scene, while neighbours came dashing out of their houses frantically to find the source of the ear-piercing explosion that was far too close for comfort. "Oh my God!" people were screaming. "What happened?" They were to see one child writhing in agony, one decimated yard shed, and one young boy looking sheepish trying to explain to the wary neighbours why he'd made a petrol bomb in the first place, his childish reasoning not impressing the neighbours at all. "It was only a bit of fun." While one of the neighbours had called the emergency services and ambulances had arrived on the scene to escort my nephew to hospital, his friend was being given the 3rd degree. "What do you think you're doing, young man? Do you realise you could have been killed or harmed an innocent bystander? What possessed you to do such an incredulous thing?" "It wasn't supposed to go off like that," he had explained. "It was supposed to go off like a firecracker. I told you, it was only a bit of fun. We got the instructions off YouTube." When I arrived at the hospital with my nephew, who should be the doctor on duty dealing with his burns, but Melanie herself, serendipity had powdered my life again. I watched in awe as she attended to my nephew's wounds. I was the one who brought him into the hospital, as I regret to say it was my backyard where the kids had made that petrol bomb, something my sister was not best pleased about. "Really, Robin," she had chided, "you know what young boys can be like. My son is always getting up to mischief. You should have kept a better eye on him. He could have been killed. They both could have been killed." I knew she was absolutely right about that. I had failed abysmally in my duty in taking better care of them. Even my neighbours said as much. It was weighing heavily on my conscience when I brought my nephew into accident and emergency. He was in a great deal of pain, but luckily the wound looked worse than it actually was. I'm only grateful that his friend was unscathed, and that the burns on my nephew were just relegated to his lower arm. When Melanie approached me, I was too distracted to really notice her. "The good news, Mr. Boxwell," she informed me, "is your son is going to be absolutely fine. He'll make a full recovery. Unfortunately, he will sustain some permanent scarring on his lower arm. But then he can carry them proudly as battle wounds, and I'm sure he'll be quite proud of them." "He's my nephew, so you're sure he's going to be all right?" "Absolutely." She then looked at me curiously. "You look familiar. Do I know you? Have we not met somewhere before?" That was when we both realised that we had met on the aeroplane from Vegas to Washington. It was Melanie. I explained I'd lost her phone number. I had intended to get in touch. "If you want to drink some time with me, you'll find me after work on a Wednesday night, having drinks at the bar on 3rd Street, she told me. And so it was, after we started meeting up regularly, that the romance blossomed between us. I was absolutely certain that she was the one for me. After dating for over a year, it was one evening when I was invited to a party with her where the vast majority of people in attendance at this cocktail function were actually involved in medicine. She left my side almost the entire evening, spent the entire time talking to another doctor, in such engaged, animated, enthused conversation. She looked so excited, so enthralled. I became incensed, being ignored like this while my girlfriend appeared to be flirting effusively with this man. Well, that was my interpretation of the event, watching her from a distance, that was. The pool party was around a large sweeping swimming pool, where no one was swimming, but there were lots of drinks flowing. Exotic, colourful cocktails with cherries and pineapples and little umbrellas garnishing the drinks, and exotic trays full of delicious snacks, along with gatherings of people who all knew each other very well. They drank champagne together, talking about medicine, so I truly felt like a fish out of water, as I hovered over the buffet table to get personally better acquainted with a platter of salmon bellinis and caviar that appeared to be beckoning me, calling my name. A young man approached the table, grinning at me brightly. "I saw you earlier on in the evening with Melanie," he said. "Abandoned you, has she?" "Something like that," I said. "You're not in medicine, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm an engineer." "Thought so. There you go," he teased. "The problem with being in medicine is sometimes all we ever talk about is medicine, even after we come home after a hard day's work. I can see Melanie is caught up in conversation over there with Dr. Radcliffe. Fascinating man he is. But she'll be back soon. Don't you worry." He was wrong about that, for Melanie did offer me some apologetic glances from a distance, even mouthing a few "I'm sorries," but she basically abandoned me all night. I was livid. My evening was spent parked around the buffet table like a spare part, having scant, meaningless conversations with people who were helping themselves to snacks, about the quality of the olives and where to source the best smoked salmon. At the end of the evening, as Melanie climbed into the truck with me, so that I could drop her off at her apartment, I piped, "I hope you're happy with yourself. Had a nice evening, did you? I'm glad someone did. I was bored as hell with only the olives and salmon bellinis for company. I barely saw you all evening. Thanks for ignoring me and abandoning me like that." "Oh, it was a brilliant evening," she said, her eyes twinkling, ignoring my sarcastic comments. "Do you know who that doctor was? Do you realise who I was speaking to?" "No, I don't. Neither do I want to. I could see you were getting very cosy with him." "It wasn't like that, Robin. This was the first chance I got to speak to Dr. Radcliffe about some of the pioneering treatments they've recently developed for burn victims. It's exciting, revolutionary stuff." So you abandoned me all evening to talk about burns with this Dr. Radcliffe, did you? Do you realise I felt like a prize idiot standing there all on my own, looking so gormless, while my girlfriend is outrageously flirting with the man? How do you think that made me feel? I'm sorry. I got carried away. I'm passionate about medicine, passionate about burns. I wasn't flirting. I was excited about what he was telling me, about some groundbreaking breakthroughs, that's all. It was perfectly innocent. You mean you're passionate about Mr. Radcliffe? I could see the way that you were ogling him. You've got it all wrong, Robin. It wasn't like that. You're making me cross now. I'm sorry I abandoned you. It wasn't intentional. This was the only opportunity I had to meet Mr. Radcliffe myself. He's not the kind of person who socialises much. To be able to talk to him like this was such a fabulous opportunity. It was wonderful to be able to talk to him about cutting-edge treatments. They were so brilliant. I learnt so much this evening. The future in burn medicine is looking very promising. I gritted my teeth angrily, and then I said something that I couldn't unsay. It's over, Melanie. We're over. I don't think we should see each other again. I spouted this angrily, my words spitting out like fire from a dragon's mouth. Melanie sat there staring out of the windscreen, not saying a single word. I could see there were tears brimming in her eyes. Fine, if that's what you want. If you must know, I think you've been very unreasonable, very pig-headed. For the rest of the journey she kept her eyes pinned on the road. Then I dropped her off at her apartment. She climbed out of the car, slammed the door behind her, walked away, not saying a single word, but I did know she was crying. Regretfully, those were the last words I'd spoken to her. My pride had stopped me from calling her back. 3 months had gone by, and there were so many times I was eager to phone her, but I just couldn't. I knew I was the one that had overreacted, seen things that weren't actually there. My girlfriend was just guilty of meeting an illustrious, distinguished doctor with a remarkable reputation in the field of burns, who was able to tell her all about the innovative, spearheading breakthroughs in burn treatments. She was just so fascinated about the subject that she had forgotten about the time, also about me. I suppose in the circumstances it was perfectly understandable, but for some reason I had said things I didn't mean to say, ended a relationship that meant the world to me. I knew I was a complete and utter and total fool. As I sat there pondering over this, so many regrets surfaced in my mind. I wanted to see my girlfriend again, but I didn't know how to go about breaking the ice or apologising to her. For all I know, she could be dating that Dr. Radcliffe fellow by now. The thought made my belly burn with indignation. The fire was now dying in the crate. It was cold out there with icy blizzard winds blowing. I could hear the winds howling outside, beating against the windows of my home, causing the boughs of the trees to sway vigorously. I just knew that I wanted to see Melanie. I didn't want to phone her. I wanted to see her right now, to apologise for overreacting. My mother's phone call seemed to have jolted me out of my slumber, brought me to my senses. I knew I didn't want to give up on Melanie, nor on us. So despite the crazy weather, I decided to take that drive in my car. It was a Friday night. I knew that on every second weekend Melanie was off. She loved to spend it at her parents' quaint wooden cabin in the countryside, an hour outside Seattle, where we'd spent many a happy weekend together. I'd go there right now, I thought. I was certain I remembered the way. Well, at least I hoped I did. A lingering dread hovered over the back of my mind, that she could be entertaining a new man in her life. Jealous twinges stung me like hundreds of jellyfish, as I remembered the way that my girlfriend had hung on to the acclaimed Mr. Radcliffe's words at that party, as if they were gold dust. Imagine if the two of them were together. I could hardly bear the thought. I knew I was crazy. I was mad, but my relationship with Melanie was worth fighting for, every inch of it. I just hoped that she would feel exactly the same. If she didn't, well, there wasn't much I could do about it, but I knew I'd never forgive myself if I didn't at least try. I threw on my anorak. The southwesterly wind was blowing fiercely, but I made the hasty dash back to my truck, climbing inside. There was a biting chill in the air. My cheeks burned as gusts of icy cold air thrashed them like cold slapping hands. It was a dark velvety night, with clusters of silvery stars twinkling from the earth's vast canopy. while a bright full moon caressed the sky with an effusive light, rendering the sky a light grey colour, which meant the visibility wasn't too bad. I sighed with relief. I knew driving in the dark could be exceedingly intimidating. I could hear the cheerful, reassuring chorus of the crickets and frogs as I left my green leafy neighbourhood, driving down Seattle's prominent asphalt roads. Much later on in the journey, I took a swift left-hand turn and veered off onto a remote dusty road well off the beaten track. I put on the radio, listened to the news and tuned in to Cairo News and Talk. I could see the wind was blowing fiercely. The occasional small piece of tree fall, usually an unstable branch cropped with clusters of leaves, had snapped off, was lying precariously in bedraggled heaps on the side of the road. There were many of them like that. This was some wind that was not for the faint-hearted. I was getting close to Melanie's parents' cabin when the red dirt road that I was supposed to turn down was blocked by a large tree that had seemingly fallen into the middle of the road, completely blocking my path. Oh, damn, I thought, just my luck. A log in the middle of the road barricading the way. This was all I needed. I climbed out of my truck, pondering whether I should move this thing or not. It was a sizable tree. I wasn't actually sure if I could shift it out of the way. As I approached the fallen tree to examine it better, something slipped out of the dark shadows. It was a figure moving towards me so graciously. It looked like it was floating. I froze to the spot, for the silhouette was easily over 8 foot tall. To my amazement, it ran up to me, waving its overlong arms at me frantically to get my attention. In the shafts of soft moonlight that dappled the contours of her body in an ethereal light, I could see her features. Her human-like face wore an expression of dread. The brown, deep-set eyes were troubled. For a second her eyes locked into mine. She held my gaze for a moment. It was almost as if she was scanning my thoughts, reading my heart, deciding whether she could trust me or not. That was when in my head I could hear an audible female voice pleading with me. Please help! Please help! My baby! My baby! I realized at once that this creature was a Bigfoot. She towered above me like a very substantial tall tree, solidly built like an army tank with a pyramid-shaped head, covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms. The creature suddenly thrust a 3-foot creature towards me that I realized was her youngling. She was pointing to its chest, making a howling sound. To my horror, I saw that its chest had been impaled with a tree branch, as the long thin sapling had plundered its chest to the other side, so that the tree branch had seared him like a skewer. It was the kind of injury that could affect the heart or cause a lung to collapse, both potentially fatal injuries. It was quite literally the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. The youngling looked terribly afraid, his mother even more so. It was amazing that the mother was so intelligent. She knew better than to remove the tree branch from her youngling's chest, seemed fully aware of the implications of such an injury. I was amazed that she was reaching out to me for help. She was so desperate. I knew this little whimpering creature did need my help. Not for a moment did I consider my own fear. I bustled the creature quickly into the front of my truck. Luckily, at 3 foot tall, it was really rather small, while the branch jutting through him was about 2 feet long. I made sure the creature was sitting in the perfect position in the front seat, so that no pressure was exerted on the branch to potentially cause more damage. I looked up at the mother, and I said to her, "I'll see what I can do." I could see a hope rising up in her brown eyes as she let me take her youngling under my charge. I needed help as soon as possible, and who better than Melanie to help me in this bizarre situation? I could hardly call an ambulance for a creature that was not exactly human, but then again, it really was. The large creature moved the fallen tree from across the road to one side so that I could get by. I realized she must have strategically placed it there to get help for her youngling, by reaching out to a human of all things. Melanie's cabin was not far from here. I could only hope that she would be there now, more than ever. I found the familiar sign in the road which read the Lazy Bear Lodge. I was now on the right path. It was a disagreeable drive, my truck jolting, wobbling, shuddering down the precipitous rocky driveway that led directly to the cabin. An uncomfortable trip, causing the little critter to let out agonized cries, as the poor thing winced, recoiled, and flinched in pain with every single bump. Finally, I was parked outside Melanie's cabin, but to my horror there were 2 other cars parked there as well, that I didn't recognise at all. The cabin looked more like a large chalet with a lovely wraparound porch. I didn't waste any time. I ran up to the front door. I know it was late at night. The wind was howling, beating and whipping my clothes. I began banging at the door as hard as I could. "Melanie! Melanie!" Melanie came to the front door, wearing a pink dressing gown, her hair all tousled, her eyes very sleepy. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she gasped. "I need your help urgently, Melanie. I've got a patient in the front of my truck. He's been impaled." "Well, haven't you called the emergency services yet?" she asked, looking shocked. "Why on earth did you bring him back to my cabin? He needs specialist care right now. An impalement is a serious injury." "That's not possible, Melanie. The patient's not entirely human. Can you not help him?" "Not entirely human?" asked Melanie, looking nonplussed. "What are you talking about?" "It's a little Bigfoot," I explained. "Its mother entrusted me with her youngling. She wants us to help him. She's desperate." "What's going on?" asked 2 female figures emerging through the doorway, with worried expressions on their faces. Both women were also wrapped in dressing gowns. Their hair looked tousled like Melanie's. It was clear that all 3 doctors were spending a girls' weekend together at her cabin. I couldn't have been in better hands with this little Bigfoot. Melanie turned around to her friends. "We're going to have to help a little Bigfoot. It's been impaled. Naturally, we can't take it to hospital because it's not human. We have to work on it here, hope for the best. Are you up for it, guys?" "Is this some kind of a wind-up?" "A Bigfoot? No, you're joking. Are you really being serious?" came the stunned response. "I mean, are those things even actually real?" "Wait and see," I said. "I'll be bringing him in now." The wind whipped against us as me and Melanie ran as quickly as we could to my truck, helping to guide the little Bigfoot out of the door. The poor thing was whimpering. He seemed overwhelmed with so many human eyes fixated on him, staring at him in wondrous awe, as seeing a Bigfoot certainly astounded the doctors, as it had done for me. But then their attention was rightly turned towards helping the idiosyncratic creature. He was a lanky little thing, with thin legs, overlong arms, and a stocky torso for one so young. "It's going to be all right," said Melanie, grabbing the Bigfoot's hand kindly and bringing him into the cabin. The creature looked at her with its bright, frightened dark eyes. "We're going to do our best to help you, I promise," she said to him. "Is he going to be all right, Melanie? Is he going to die?" "It depends on a lot of things," Melanie told me. "It depends whether the sapling has caused any internal damage. The creature's fortunately got a large chest. We can only hope that the impalement has not caused internal bleeding, rupturing or puncturing. We're just going to have to pray that everything goes well. Keep your fingers crossed. We haven't got the technology here that we have at the hospital for scans and stuff like that. I can't promise you that the youngling is going to survive, but we'll do our level best to make sure that he does. That's all we can hope for in the circumstances." They took the little creature into a little room where Melanie had some medical supplies, and as luck would have it, an oxygen tank. I sat back awkwardly on the comfortable upholstered chair in the living room, clenching my fists anxiously, knowing full well that things could go terribly pear-shaped. I was solicitous and disquieted about the poor Bigfoot mother, who'd reached out to me for help. How would she react if I returned her youngling back to her dead? Even more extraordinary, how did that poor thing manage to get impaled by a branch? It was all exceedingly bizarre. I began to pace around the cabin anxiously, while the wind continued to howl outside the windows, and the Douglas fir trees in the woodgrove that surrounded the cabin were almost dancing in the wind. I could hear the youngling's painful cries coming from the room. I tried to block my ears. The sound was very disturbing. "Please, God," I prayed, don't let this poor thing die." As my anxiety escalated, I could feel a cold chill running down my spine, so I busied myself restocking the timbers of the fire in the crate. Some of the timber was still smouldering from the evening's fire, so I added some timber along with some steel wool. A perfect fire starter. In a trice the fire was burning brightly in the crate. I glanced around the living area, and there were dirty wine glasses smeared with lipstick marks on the rims. They were on the coffee table, along with a massive pizza box and dirty plates. I decided to distract myself, so I took the dirty plates and glasses to the sink and began to wash up the dishes. It felt good to keep myself busy and occupied. I glanced out of the kitchen window of the cabin. I could see the tall silhouette of the mother Bigfoot pacing up and down as she moved between the tall Douglas firs and the woodgrove. I was stunned. She'd followed us all the way to the cabin. She looked like any other mother in a hospital waiting room, frantically worried about their child. I was struck by how human she appeared, despite the fact that she was so enormous from every perspective. Melanie finally entered the kitchen. In her hand she held the sapling branch that had pierced the Bigfoot. I took it into my hands, marvelling that this thing had gone right through the torso of a little youngling. It was badly smeared with blood. "I'm sorry," she said. "We did everything we could." Her face looked stern and very sober. I dropped the sapling branch on the ground, where it fell on the wooden floor with a crash. I wrapped my arms over my head and began to cry out in despair. "Please, God, it's not dead. Please don't tell me it's dead." "Don't be silly, I'm only kidding," teased Melanie. "It went seamlessly. The news is good. There wasn't much bleeding at all. The sapling branch didn't touch any vital organs or even touch the lungs, so he's a very lucky Bigfoot indeed. We've stitched him up very nicely and he's good to go, but he'll be a bit tender in that spot for a while. But no harm's been done, so it was an excellent job all in all." All three doctors entered the room smiling brightly, with very happy-looking expressions on their faces, with the little Bigfoot walking beside them. His eyes were so filled with joy. He darted towards the sapling on the floor and began chattering excitedly to us in a strange language as he examined it. "That's right," said Melanie. "That was in you. Can you believe it? But we got it out." The creature began to bounce up and down like an excitable dog. "I think we should give him something to eat," said Melanie. "The poor creature's had a nasty shock." She rifled through her fridge, bringing out a large slice of apple pie for the creature. When presented with the apple pie, the creature lifted it up to his flat nose and sniffed it. Then he took a bite, loved the taste. He virtually poured the contents of the entire plate down his mouth, chewing it happily and presenting his plate back to Melanie for another slice. She couldn't refuse him. I think he ended up eating the entire pie, but nobody was saying a word. "I'll be back in a moment," I said. "I need to get the mother. I saw her in the woodgrove anxiously pacing up and down between the Douglas fir trees. I think she's desperate to get news of her youngling. It took her an enormous amount of courage to reach out to me to get help. She even blocked the road with a timber beam so that I was forced to get out of my truck, which was when she approached me." "Wow, I'm impressed. That is incredible," said Melanie. "What a resourceful mother, who would stop at nothing to help her child, even if it meant reaching out to a human. She was clever not to remove the sapling pole from her youngling's torso. You go and get her, Robin." I opened the cabin door to be hit by the whipping currents of ice-cold air, and of course the howling wind. It was freezing out there. The wind had gained strength, so I felt as if my whole body was being pummelled against a powerful force, but I didn't even care. Out of the trees a shadowy figure moved towards me so gracefully. Once again she looked like she was floating. It was the Bigfoot female. I could see that her deep-set dark eyes were full of anxiety, but one look at me and she seemed to sense that the news was good, as a light came on in her eyes. It would seem her deflated, sagging body rejuvenated like a flower in the meadow after the spring rain has fallen, as it straightened, which made her body appear even taller. "It all went well," I said, hoping that she could understand my words. "We couldn't have asked for a better outcome." I felt like a doctor talking to a patient's parent after an intense surgery and giving her the good news. She clearly did comprehend what I was saying, as she let out a couple of delighted whoops and began jumping up and down on her legs for joy. She followed me to the cabin. The door was flung open by Melanie. It blew back violently against the log pole beams of the cabin. The little Bigfoot came tearing out of the cabin as fast as he could. He was faster than the wind, dashing towards his mother with the sapling piece in his hands, which he couldn't wait to show her. She threw him up in the air in delight, catching him in her arms. The youngling showed her the sapling piece that had gone through him. The mother examined it with an expression of absolute wonderment on her face. She rubbed her fingers across the wound. She looked impressed to see that the hole in her son's torso had finally been sewn up. The Bigfoot female looked at us. Her eyes were full of gratitude. She nodded to us, turned around and glided away, disappearing into the trees, while the wind kept howling. "Get back inside," said Melanie, pushing me back into the cabin. Before you catch your death of cold, that wind is not about to let up any time soon. This is Robin, she told her two friends. Robin, this is Alice and Jennifer. Good to meet you, I said. Thank you for helping me out tonight. Alice grinned. I knew it was going to be exciting coming out to the cabin for the weekend with Melanie, but I never expected to be operating on a Bigfoot. This has been one of the most exciting nights of my life that I shan't forget in a hurry. I'm glad we could help the poor little fellow. But even at such a young age, he had such a robust body. If he had been fully human, he might never have survived that impalement, never. But he was built of tough stuff, that little thing. Melanie, can I have a word? Of course, she said. I miss you, I told her. I miss us. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for overreacting at that party. No, I'm sorry. You were right. I shouldn't have abandoned you in the way that I did at the party. It was so inconsiderate of me, selfish even. I'm the one that should be sorry. I also miss you. To cut a long story short, I'm glad to inform you that me and Melanie rekindled the flame of our relationship. We are now happily married, have been so for 20 long years. Now I know better than to get jealous when doctors get caught up in discussing medicine. We all decided to keep what happened between us with that Bigfoot youngling. We kept it a secret. We are desirous for those beautiful creatures to live together in peace without being bothered by humans. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.